Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel. In this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And today we will start with the most important topic of these days. We're going to talk about Ukrainian mineral resources. I'll remind you that several days ago the United States of America sent their own representative with the purpose to sign some kind of agreement between Ukraine and the United States of America. But later, during the Munich Security Conference, we found out that Zelensky refused to sign this agreement, and that probably shocked the United States of America. But later, more precisely this morning, we started receiving updates that gave us the real understanding of the real reasons why Zelensky refused to sign this agreement. So let's discuss them in details. There are no security guarantees. The US wanted to present Zelensky with the fait accompli so that he would blindly sign an agreement on mineral resources. In Munich, during a meeting with the bipartisan group of US senators, Zelensky was concerned about the American proposal to invest in Ukrainian mineral resources. He thought he was being unreasonably asked to sign something that he had not had time to read, one of the Senate sources said. Democratic Senator Brian Schatz, who was asked after the meeting with whether Zelensky considered the US proposal one-sided, replied, "I think that's fair." So later we got additional details about the situation, additional statements made by Zelensky. For example, Zelensky stated that the US offered Zelensky to sign documents giving the US rights to 50% of Ukraine's future, not just the current, but future minerals resources, but he refused. That was stated by the Washington Post. Also, Zelensky stated that when he was reading this agreement, he haven't found even a single statement regarding the security guarantees, because Zelensky, the main purpose of Zelensky and the main purpose of this deal with the mineral resources is the security guarantees. And now we see that there are lots of sides who is going to take place to participate in this process. So what we have, Zelensky decided to sell Ukraine completely. He will sell Ukraine. When talking about selling Ukraine completely, first of all, he's talking about rare metals and rare minerals. The first buyer was the United States of America, and when Zelensky was hot, when the deal was hot, the United States of America was trying to be the first and to force Zelensky, under the pressure of the reputation of Donald Trump, to force him to sign an agreement in complete US favor. But most likely later, the European countries thought a lot, and they decided that they have possibilities to provide some security guarantees to Kyiv in exchange for some part of these mineral resources. And at this very moment, Zelensky realized that this is exactly the place, this is exactly the thing that he can use to play with the countries, to force them to start fighting to each other for Ukraine, for Ukrainian mineral resources. For example, now we have a lot of updates from the European Union that they want to support Kyiv, that they can send forces. For example, we start receiving lots of updates that European Union is able to send up to 100,000 soldiers. Some sources are saying that the European Union is ready to send just 25,000. European can provide Ukraine with only 25,000 soldiers to accommodate, but at least 120,000 is needed. So this is something like a trade. So the European countries are saying that you give us the mineral resources, we will not pay you money, but we will send you some contingent that will secure the line of combat contact or support you. But obviously Zelensky understands that it is not enough. He understands that his mineral resources cost at least 100,000 soldiers or 120,000 soldiers. So there is a very, very interesting process is taking place here. So let's wait and see what is going to be next. But the most important thing, that Europe and the United States of America are not the only parts of this deal, are not the only parts that want to take control over the mineral resources. Russia is on the other side, and this is very important because Russia understand that Russia can continue moving further, and the more the Russians are moving further in the western direction, the more mineral resources the Russians are taking under their control. And the Russians also have a buyer, and we are talking about China. So the thing is that while the western countries, United States of America, European Union, is trying to understand who will get what in this conflict, in this situation, China is already about to begin the production of different enterprises that that will extract these mineral resources from the surface. China is preparing to open its production facilities for resources extraction in the territories of Ukraine occupied by Russia. Currently, companies from China are building factories in the lands of the east of former Ukraine occupied by Russians and supplying local enterprises with equipment. Everyone is waiting for the signing of a peace treaty to begin working fully. So this is very important because this situation shows that China will get access to very cheap resources on the territory of Ukraine, and then China will tell the Europeans what's the price they should buy this or that resource. Of course, Putin will take something in exchange for this, so that's why we believe that in the very near future the Western countries will intensify their activities in this process with the purpose to get as much as possible and not to allow China to improve their positions here. So as we can see, by the third year of the special military operation, we see that both the Russians and the Ukrainians managed to do one thing. They managed to force other countries to be more involved in this conflict. And of course, if China begins investing money in the resources, in extraction of resources, and if somebody from the Western countries will, let's say, puts a question about the legal rights of China for this or that resource, of course, something may happen between these countries. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next, but obviously the situation is very critical. Now let's move to the line of combat contact, and we will start probably with the most important areas, and first we're going to discuss the situation in the Sudzha direction. According to information we have, the Russians continue clashes for the settlement of Sverdlikova. For example, yesterday the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. Anyway, when talking about Sverdlikova, there is a very fast dynamic. Almost every single day we adjust the map. For example, yesterday we adjusted the western central parts, and as for the beginning of the 15th of February, we have adjusted this small pocket. I'll remind you that several days ago the pro-Russian resources colored these fields completely in Russian favor, but just today on the 15th of February the neutral mappers confirmed this information. We haven't received anything special from the area of Ukraine counterattack, where they counterattacked several days ago, which means most likely that there is no activities here. Furthermore, the Russians continue destroying Ukrainian vehicles. That's the armored force of Ukraine is trying to send in the direction of Sudzha, but everything that enter N07 road is entering the death road and most likely would be destroyed during several hours or several minutes. So this is the situation in this direction. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the southern Kupiansk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. According to information we have, the Russians are about to finish the battle for the settlement by the name of Yampolovka. This is the last settlement before this small village of Tarskoye, and the village of Tarskoye is the last village on the Russian side of the river of Zherebets. So we are about to see complete collapse of Ukrainian positions on this side of the river, and most likely this is going to be the beginning of the battle for the settlement of Liman. So let's take a look at these geolocations again. We have a lot of icons, as you can see. This icon shows us the attack of Ukrainian FPV drone on the edge positions of the armored forces of Russian Federation in the settlement. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map. We have colored this forest, this part of Yampolovka in Russian favor. Different pro-Russian resources adjusted more territories in Russian favor. They colored the settlement of Yampolovka completely. So maybe today the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation will confirm this information. As for us, we haven't adjusted the entire village because we still continue receiving updates from the most southwestern part of the settlement that there are still Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian vehicles, and many other things. So anyway, it probably doesn't matter right now, because most likely in a day or in 2 days the Russians will seize control over this territory. Now let's move further. As for the Konstantinivka direction, the Russians are pushing. Today we have a lot of very interesting icons, and the most important is that the Russians published first videos from the territory of the settlement Novodmitrivka, and as you can see, this is already the outskirts of the settlement of Konstantinivka. So now the Russians established complete control over FPV drone control over the first blocks of the first micro districts of Konstantinivka. This is very important because, as I remember, this is the first video when the Russians managed to reach the outskirts of the settlement and when the Russians managed to destroy something on the outskirts of Konstantinivka. This is very important, and this is very important media attack, very important psycho attack on Ukrainians in this area. For them, something has changed. Of course, they were living in completely different reality when the city of Konstantinivka was a city in deep rear, and now the situation has been changed completely. Now it's not the deep rear, it's already the line of combat contact. Now let's move further, and the Russians are showing a very fast dynamic in the area of Vozdvizhenka. You know that probably this is the fastest direction ever. Let's say not like ever, but along the entire line of combat contact. I'll remind you that the Russians began their offensive operation in this area several days ago. Basically, first the Ukrainians were the side that counterattack, and Ukrainians somewhere on the 10th of February, managed to restore control over the settlement of Vodyane II. But then the Russians regrouped, and probably that wasn't just like counterattack, that was something like attempt to shorten the lines and to maintain the gray zone, with the purpose not to allow the Russians to advance very fast and very deep. And on the 11th, by the 11th of February, the Russians began offensive. First, according to different sources, the Russians managed to cut M32 road once again. I'll remind you, they managed to do this several weeks ago or months ago. Then by the end of the 12th of February, we start receiving updates about very heavy clashes for Vodyane II. And by the end of the 30th of February, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation confirmed that the settlement of Vodyane II was captured by the Russians completely. We have video published by the Ukrainian side how they were attacking and bombing Russian vehicles and tanks that were heading towards the settlement. By the end of the 14th of February, we got report that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Zelene Polye. This information, as you can see, was confirmed both by pro-Russian resources and by the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation. And this morning, by the beginning of the 15th of February, we got additional changes on the ground. The most important is the Russians began offensive operation in the direction of the settlement of Malinovka. This is very important advance, very important offensive, because by taking under control the settlement of Malinovka and Mirne, the Russians will be able to secure the flank, the western flank, and not so allow the Ukrainians from the Pokrovsk agglomeration to counterattack. The Russians most likely will try to dig in deeper in this area with the purpose to block and repel any possible attack from the Ukrainian side. Another offensive operation took place in the direction of the settlement by the name of Tarasovka. Today the Russians reported that small village of Berezovka to the north of Vodyane II was captured by the Russians completely. Based on the reports that were published by pro-Ukrainian sources, we have adjusted the map. So we see that the flower of Vozdvizhenka is blooming. The situation for the Ukrainians is very critical, and this is exactly the area where most likely we're gonna see the general battle. You know that now we have a lot of talks about negotiation process, that China will take resources, United States of America will take resources, Russia will take land, Russia will restore control over the borders of 1991. A lot of talks, a lot of wishful thinking, but the reality is nobody is ready for negotiation process, because both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians, China and the Western countries, have lots of forces, have lots of big armies, and these armies are not exhausted. So there is no, let's say, reason to talk about peace until the general battle. And as I understand, the general battle of 2025 is going to take place between the city of Pokrovsk and the city of Konstantinivka. First, during the first part of 2025, probably before the beginning of summer, the Russians will try to take under control as much as possible territories along M32 road to reach the Kliban-Bytska water reservoir and to maintain the lines with the city of Toretsk. So everything inside of this red line, the Russians will try to take under complete control in the very near future. And this will allow the Russians to get the most important positions. It's like a checkmate position when Ukrainians will be forced to make a decision. What city has the biggest priority, the city of Konstantinivka or the city of Pokrovsk? Because from these positions the Russians will have equal chances to attack both settlements, and for these purposes the Russians gonna have to use just one army. But the Ukrainians, to hold their positions, will be forced to keep forces, very huge forces, huge armies in both settlements, because they don't know where exactly the Russians are going to attack. And obviously, the Russians will prefer this direction where the Ukrainians has less forces. So this is the general battle, and most likely the Ukrainians, as a result of the battle for these two cities, will lose both. And this is going to be the end of the general battle. And after that, they're going to be like aftermath of these events. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continue also another their offensive operation. As for Ulakli Constantinople pocket, as you can see, almost every single day we have small changes on the ground. The beginning of the 5th of February is not an exception. According to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the fields and to get a bit closer to the settlement of Ulakli. Also, the Russians published several videos of how they were FPV droning Ukraine vehicles with drones using the fiber optic technology. Very interesting updates we continue receiving from the Velika Novoselivka direction. Another day, another adjustments on the map. As you can see, there is another place, another area where we can see very fast dynamic of the armored force of Russian Federation. Almost every single day we adjust the map in the Russian favor. So this is the situation by the 10th of February, and starting of this date we start receiving more and more updates, which were confirmed both by pro-Ukrainian sources, by pro-Russian sources, by neutral resources. The Russians are moving and the Ukrainians can't do anything with this. As for now, it's very difficult to understand what exactly the Russians are planning to do. We have another video that shows additional Russian progress on the ground in the area of Rozliev, so Razdolne. They're moving in the northern directions towards Adradne. In this video we can see something like reconnaissance in force. The Russians were using several vehicles. They sent these vehicles in direction of fields or open fields, probably with the purpose to understand and to discover the Ukrainian FPV drone positions and artillery positions, because as I understand this area is unknown for the Russians. They don't know where the Ukrainian positions. Of course the intelligence is working, but there are still a lot of work to do. So this operation has begun. As for now, we have several active offensives. The Konstantinivka Pokrovsk offensive, the South Donetsk offensive, we have the Liman direction, we have Dvorichna direction, we have of course Sudzha area. And the thing is that probably for the previous half a year we haven't received almost anything from the Orekhov direction, which is very weird. We see that both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, both the Russians and the Ukrainians, they shortened the line of combat contact, making just a small part of Frontline as active. So the lines between Dnipro, let's say between Kherson and Sudzha, the front line is more than 1,000 kilometers. But basically the clashes are taking place just along 30% of this area, which is also very important. I believe that this might be also part of a deal between the Western countries and let's say Russia. And that's it for the short video. Military summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.